When we talk about contemporary Turkey, we think of the long career of the current president Erdoğan, but we will come slowly to talk about his politics. First, a little geography which never hurts.
We are dealing with a nation in the middle between southeastern Europe and Western Asia, divided into two peninsular regions, Eastern Thrace and Anatolia, bordered to the northwest by Greece and Bulgaria, to the south by Syria and Iraq, and to the east by Iran, Armenia and Georgia. Thanks to its strategic location, the country has positioned itself as a bridge between different cultures, benefiting from democratic influences from the old continent and becoming a role model for all Middle Eastern countries aspiring to a synthesis of Islam and the rule of law.
Now we are witnessing a reversal, and the recent authoritarian drift has greatly slowed down the process of establishing democratic principles.
We can say that the beginning of these processes dates back to the late 19th century, when competition with European powers led some of the cultural elites within the Ottoman Empire to push for modernization, a goal that according to some could be achieved by maintaining a synthesis between Islamic faith and state institutions, but which according to others, including the famous Mustafa Kemal, required a clean break between state and religion, which had to be limited to the private sphere of the citizen. After the 1923 elections that saw the victory of the Republican People's Party, led by Atatürk, Turkish became the official language in place of Arabic, the form of state was revised in a republican key, a head of state and a prime minister appointed by the head of state were established.
Then, within the following year, to solve the problem of the difficult coexistence between democracy and Islam, Islam was erased from the country's daily life by abolishing the Sultanate, Caliphate and Islamic courts.
This wasn't such a clean exit, however, since despite the forced secularization, Sunni Islam continued to remain very deeply rooted, especially among the rural and less educated population, also thanks to the influence that religious brotherhoods have always exerted on every aspect of society.
These include the Sufi-oriented Naqshbandi, to which Necmettin Erbakan, Erdogan's political father, belonged, and the Hizmet, founded by Fethullah Gülen, which Erdogan used to rise to power and with which he came into open conflict during the attempted coup of 2016. However, what were the highlights of the Kemalist reforms?
With the establishment of the Republic of Turkey on October 29, 1923, legislative and executive powers passed into the hands of the Assembly, which was responsible for electing the President of the Republic, the head of the sole party, for 4-year terms. The head of state, in turn, appointed the President of the Council of Ministers and the members of the Council itself. Completing the picture were the stated independence of the judiciary, the recognition of the formal equality of citizens before the law, and the granting of the active and passive vote to women. A milestone achieved in 1934, long before several European countries. But it was in 1937 that the most important constitutional reform took place, the one that defined the so-called 6 arrows of the Turkish state: republican, nationalist, populist, statist, reformist and secular.
Atatürk's death in 1938 and the shift from single party to multiple political formations caused by a number of adverse circumstances, including economic backwardness compared to the West, were two of the main reasons that prevented full democratic transition.
As the years passed, there was the emergence of more liberal currents promoting private initiative that met with the support of the dissatisfied middle class and less literate rural classes. Among these, gaining the most support was Adnan Menderes' Democrat Party, which in the 1950 elections succeeded in ousting the old single party and demolishing the pillars of Kemalism. Measures such as the call to prayer in Arabic, the opening of many mosques, and the reading via state radio of passages from the Quran would allow religious values to re-emerge, in contrast to the previous statist vision.
The situation is also very similar in contemporary Turkey. On the one hand, the aspiration for a secular and democratic society as stated in the constitution, but on the other hand, a deeply religious society that struggles to recognize itself in national democratic institutions.
Despite the new government's good achievements, including membership in the International Monetary Fund, openness to both the West and Arab countries, and decent economic growth, social tensions simmering in the background erupted in the famous Istanbul Pogrom of 1955. when a right-wing nationalist group clashed with a Greek minority present in the city's suburbs, resulting in the deaths of 30 people. Menderes' party was accused of taking an authoritarian turn and planning the pogrom despite its declared democratic openness. So, to restore order and prevent a religious drift in the country, the army, as the guardian of the constitution, seized power by force on May 27, 1960.
This date frames the first of 4 military coups in the period between 1960 and 1997, during which the secular organs of the state, represented by the military, several times came face to face against the confessional parties.
An important step is found in the second coup of 1971, but especially in the third in 1980, because they served to inaugurate the so-called Turkish Islamic synthesis, that is, the fusion of Kemalism and Sunni Islam. In essence, the military, in order to prevent the secularity of the state from being compromised, decided to come to an agreement with the Islamic components of society, becoming the bridge for Islam to officially penetrate the institutions.
Long story short, in the 80s this was the situation.
After the coup was over, a consulting assembly formed by the supreme military organ, the National Security Council, and constitutionalist experts was charged with drafting the constitution. It stated the democratic and secular nature of the Turkish state, confirmed the role of the supreme military organ as the protector of social order, and expanded the powers of the government and the President of the Republic. The new electoral law then set the threshold for entering parliament at 10%, so that in 1983 only 3 parties competed for seats: the People's Party, the Nationalist Party, and the Motherland Party. The latter was supported by the Brotherhoods and founded by Turgut Özal, who won 45% of the seats and became the ruling party.
Özal's party succeeded in embodying that Turkish Islamic synthesis I mentioned, bringing together the military, the Brotherhoods, and the small and medium business class.
However, persistent economic backwardness combined with corruption and inefficiency in the state began to foster the emergence of the Welfare Party, founded by Erbakan in 1987, and in which a young Erdoğan was beginning to make his mark. The party wasn't driven by any particular ideology, but through a team of economists tried to come up with the best solutions to the problem of the broken state finances.
It was an effort that paid off, as in the 1994 local government elections, the party won in more than 20 municipalities, including Istanbul, where Erdoğan was elected mayor, and in the July 1996 general elections, Erbakan crowned his dream of becoming prime minister.
But before long, Erbakan would be way over his head, as conservative policies implemented by his local administrators began to anger the military. These included plans to build a mosque in Istanbul's Taksim Square, a place symbolic of the Western way of life, and the desire to convert the former Saint Sophia Basilica into a mosque, another symbol of Turkey's secular tradition, since it had been turned into a museum in 1934 by the will of Atatürk himself. In addition, contacts between the Welfare Party and other Middle Eastern Islamic groups, such as the Palestinian Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and the Algerian Islamic Salvation Front, were putting the party in a bad light in the eyes of the military.
And here we come to the fourth coup of 1997, also called the postmodern coup, because it was implemented without bloodshed, with Erbakan banned from political life, accused of stealing public funds and inciting religious hate.
The Welfare Party was dismantled, and in its place was born the following year the Virtue Party, into which the young Erdoğan joined, even though shortly before he had been sentenced to 10 months in prison. And given his excellent record as mayor of Istanbul, it's not surprising that much of the population considered his detention an injustice that would have made him even more charming.
Anyway, of the originally planned 10 months, Erdoğan served only 4, since in 2001 the Turkish Constitutional Court granted amnesty to Virtue Party members who had been banned from public office.
At that point, the party split into 2 fronts: the conservative wing of the Islamic Matrix and the wing of the so-called innovators, the young moderate reformists, of which Erdoğan became the leader, founding the Justice and Development Party on August 14 of that year.
In the November 3, 2002 elections, the AKP became the first party, with 34.3% of the vote. But for some reasons that I won't go into here, Erdoğan had to lead from behind the scenes, letting his loyal right-hand man Abdullah Gül replace him as prime minister.
The AKP, on the strength of its policy proposals aimed at reviving the country's economic situation, hit by the 2001 crisis and rising inflation, would set up a Muslim government inspired by European democracies, but with a Sunni Islamic emphasis. As Gül himself said, although some of us are religiously oriented individuals, we don't want to be defined as a religious party. We want to prove that a Muslim-majority country can be democratic, transparent, and compatible with the modern world. Major achievements in the early 2000s, including economic growth of 5% annually, diversification of foreign trade, and an aid program for the poorer sections of the population, projected Turkey into the role of a regional power, making it a viable candidate for entry into the European Union, so much so that negotiations reopened as early as October 2005.
Dear Erdogan, if last year you hadn't confined Ursula von der Leyen to that little couch, maybe your flag would also be in Brussels today. Jokes aside, internally the reform of the National Security Council was important. Remember, the supreme military organ, which was downgraded to an advisory organ, thus lessening the military's grip on institutions.
In short, a series of achievements that led the AKP to prevail in the July 22, 2007 elections, with as many as 46.6% of votes in favor, corresponding to 341 seats. But on balance, the most important achievement for the Turkish leader was that of having succeeded in getting Abdullah Gül elected to the position of President of the Republic, which had in fact consolidated his power over the opposition.
The situation that had been created, however, was a harbinger of a dangerous authoritarian drift, because the government would be able to push through laws bordering on constitutional legitimacy without the head of state casting any kind of veto.
Starting in 2008, a number of events threatened to compromise the Prime Minister's career forever. First and foremost, the law restoring the veil for women in universities almost cost the party closure for anti-like activities, according to the dossier submitted by the chief prosecutor of the Turkish Supreme Court.
The rescue came when the Constitutional Court, called to rule on the issue, initially declared the law contrary to the Constitution, but a few months later reversed itself on public interest grounds.
Then it was the turn of the Prime Minister's very strong reaction against the members of the Ergenekon, an alleged Kemalist-style secret organization composed mainly of senior army officials, established with the aim of overthrowing the government and seizing power in a coup. However, an affair that remains unclear to this day, with many accusing Erdogan himself of organizing everything to dispose of his political opponents.
A 2016 ruling would partially confirm these fears by releasing most of those convicted.
Finally, it was in May 2013 that there was a harsh crackdown on environmentalist protests against the construction of a shopping mall in the green area of Gezi Park, near Taksim Square. On that occasion, police intervened against the protesters using tear gas and water cannons. The media and newspapers loyal to the government tried to cover up the news, but this caused the event to resonate even more through social networks such as Facebook and Twitter, which were blacked out.
Anyway, the turbulent situation that had been created was not enough to undermine the popularity of Erdogan, who, having reached the three-term limit and unable to run again for the leadership of the government, ran for the presidency of the Republic in 2014 and won with 52% of the votes in favor.
At that point, the new Turkey project desired by the president required annihilating the last internal opponent still capable of challenging him. I'm referring to that Fethullah Gülen, who had long ago helped him get rid of the Kemalists, and who, after the Gezi Park affair, had instead obstructed him.
His brotherhood, let's remember, the Hizmet, was from then on branded as terrorists and targeted by government forces. The democratic values that had brought the ruling party to prominence back in 2002 had been betrayed, with the society sharply divided between supporters and opponents of the regime, and the president with little tolerance for his enemies.
Frequent was the use of Article 299 of the Turkish Penal Code, which provided for imprisonment for all those who offended the President of the Republic, a measure that, among other things, in 2021 was declared by the European Court of Human Rights to be detrimental to freedom of expression.
The authoritarian drift was so obvious that even within Erdogan's own party, scorched earth had been made.
A few years earlier, the Gezi Park affair had caused the removal of loyalist Gül, and in May 2016, trusted Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu was also removed, due to differences in political views, and replaced by Binali Yildirim. Boiling tensions erupted on that Friday evening, July 15, 2016, when a reporter from state TV TRT began reading a lengthy statement from the coup plotters, announcing the seizure of power. At the same time, the military had occupied the southern bridges over the Bosphorus in Istanbul, and 2 jets flew over the city, spreading terror among the population. Erdoğan declared in a live video feed made from his smartphone that he had survived the attack, and called for citizens to take to the streets to defend democracy.
It was hours of terror. In Ankara, the parliamentary headquarters was hard hit by the air force and reduced to a pile of rubble. But by the next morning it was clear that the coup had failed, as army units still loyal to the president managed to restore the status quo.
Even today it's difficult to say who organized the coup. At first, Aaron Stein claimed that it was some departments of the 1st and 2nd armies that carried it out, along with the support of elements of the Air Force, Navy and Coast Guard. Another article by political scientist Svante Kornel asserted instead that it had been the work of an unlikely alliance between old-style Kemalists and Gülenists. Anyway, the casualties were about 240 civilians and a few military personnel. Nothing compared to those who would die or be forced to flee because of the government's harsh reaction. One thing is certain, that was indeed the golden opportunity to wipe out all the main opponents and more. In fact, Gülen was blamed as the architect of the coup, backed by the CIA.
Quick parenthesis. Remember that the last period of the war in Syria had brought relations between Russia and Turkey closer together, meeting with a lot of criticism from the United States.
After that, a state of emergency was declared, and not only the sectors of the military and civil service involved in the coup were affected, but also those with whom in the previous 15 years of rule the party had to come to terms in order to secure power. I leave you with the detailed account of the various arrests and dismissals that followed.
At that point, this would have been the icing on the cake, to lay hands on the constitution with reform and move the country toward a strong presidentialism inspired by the French model.
The coup had caused the main opposition forces to express solidarity with the president and show willingness to consider the proposed constitutional reform. However, the quorum needed to pass the amendments wasn't reached, and it was appropriate to go through a referendum. On April 16, 2017, Erdoğan won with just 51.41%, a victory that, among other things, was criticized both by domestic oppositions, which accused the government of electoral fraud, and by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Council of Europe.
It was an outcome that reflected the deep internal rift in the country, where Erdoğan's legitimacy was slowly being challenged by a general climate of protest over arrests and repression by the authorities that went far beyond those belonging to Fethullah Gülen's organization.
It was very difficult for the oppositions to work, because at the first mistake they risked being branded as Gülenists, which over time has become synonymous with terrorists. Today's Turkey, which will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Republic in 2023, has at its leadership a president far away from the figure the father of the Turks envisioned. Of the Kemalist 6 arrows, very few remain intact, and among them it's clear that secularism is no longer among the features of the Turkish state. But still, the political involution we are witnessing has been countered by economic growth, such that the country has become a major regional power.
That was at least until the most recent monetary policies led to the devaluation of the Turkish lira, culminating in the currency crisis of 2021 and the consequent rise in inflation, generating the risk of stagnation in the economy due to the rising cost of living and falling internal demand.
All of this would also impact the degree of discontent, so much so that in polls, approval ratings toward Erdoğan's actions would have dropped from 55.8% in March 2020 to 38.6% at the end of 2021, the lowest percentage in recent years, even lower than in early 2019, when dissatisfaction with the performance of the economy had caused Erdoğan to lose control of Istanbul and Ankara in local elections.
But it's good to stop here for today. I thank you all for your attention and I will see you in the next video. Ciao!